President Vladimir Putin, a bombshell from the Justice Department has put Russian interference in the 2016 election front and center. A grand jury has indicted a dozen Russian operatives for hacking into computers and releasing stolen emails on the internet. It is not believed this action altered the outcome of the election. We have Fox team coverage. Julian Turner looks at what is on the president's agenda for Helsinki and how today's revelations affect it. John Roberts in London on what the president is saying about the Putin meeting. And we begin with Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge at the Justice Department with details of the indictment. Good evening, Catherine.
Thanks, Mike, and good evening. This 29-page indictment from the Russia Special Counsel makes a direct connection between the 2016 election meddling and Vladimir Putin.
The Deputy Attorney General made the announcement at Maine Justice.
The indictment charges 12 Russian military officers by name for conspiring to interfere with the 2016 presidential election.
During the 2016 campaign, the defendants, all members of Russian intelligence known as the GRU, are accused of hacking Democrats' emails, then releasing them, as well as targeting companies that supply voter software. In some cases, masquerading as U.S. citizens, the Russian operatives flooded the web with emails from the Clinton campaign, DNC, and DCCC.
The conspirators created fictitious online personas, including DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0. The defendants falsely claimed that DC Leaks was a group of American hackers and that Guccifer 2.0 was a lone Romanian hacker.
The indictment says Guccifer 2.0 got a request for stolen documents from a candidate for the U.S. Congress who wanted records about his opponent. While not drawing a direct connection, the indictment states that hackers for the first time targeted a company used by Clinton's personal office on or about the same day candidate Trump said this.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
In a statement, a White House spokesperson emphasized there is no allegation Americans knew they were corresponding with Russians, no allegation any American citizen committed a crime, and no allegation that the conspiracy changed the vote count. On Capitol Hill, the reaction was swift.
This is the appropriate supervised scope. Whether you are Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, we should be concerned about cybersecurity, whether they breach a system that has to do with the DNC or DCCC, or if it's a Republican network.
It tells us what we already know. Russia hacked, Russia spread false news, Russia was trying to help Trump win the presidency. But it provides the additional details that make it even more difficult for Putin to deny it.
Lawmakers commended Special Counsel Robert Mueller for the indictments, providing more granularity on the theft and release of political emails, calling on the president to tone down the rhetoric.
My hope would be that the president and his allies would cease and desist from calling the Mueller investigation a witch hunt.
The indictment sends a strong message, but legal experts say it is unlikely the Russians will extradite military intelligence officers to the U.S. for prosecution. Mike.
Catherine, former FBI attorney Lisa Page was on Capitol Hill today testifying behind closed doors. What are you hearing about what went down?
Well, Lisa Page got to Capitol Hill about 4 hours ago, Mike, and our cameras were there. We asked her whether she listened to the testimony yesterday from FBI agent Peter Strzok, who was pressed on their anti-Trump text messages, whether her legal team had coordinated with his legal team, and whether she had any regrets. And in the last few minutes, we've received some new information from Republican Congressman Mark Meadows, who told us, quote, she is providing new information and it is credible. The session today should wrap up probably in the next hour, 90 minutes. We also anticipate she will have a second deposition, sort of the second half of this interview on Monday, and they have the capability to go into classified if it's needed, Mike.
Catherine Herridge leading us off from the Department of Justice. Catherine, many thanks. Before the indictments were announced, President Trump said he would bring up the interference issue with Vladimir Putin, but did not expect a full confession. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts tells us the president also had a bit of a royal mess to clean up. John's in London tonight. Hello, John.
And Mike, good evening to you. On both stops of this European trip, the president has begun his visit by taking to task leaders on issues that irritate him. At NATO, it was German Chancellor Angela Merkel over a pipeline. And here in the UK, it was his host, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, over Brexit. At Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country retreat, a reset of sorts. President Trump insisting he was not criticizing Theresa May in an interview with the Sun newspaper.
I didn't criticize the Prime Minister. I have a lot of respect for the Prime Minister.
On Wednesday, President Trump told the Sun May's plans for a soft Brexit, maintaining some ties to the European Union, would likely make impossible any bilateral trade deal with the United States.
It'll definitely affect trade with the United States, unfortunately in a negative way. I did give her my views on what she should do and how she should negotiate, and she didn't follow those views. I would actually say she probably went the opposite way.
Today, the president walked that back, saying the UK can do what it wants on Brexit, and that he hopes they can put together a trade deal.
When I saw her this morning, I said, I want to apologize because I said such good things about you. She said, don't worry, it's only the press.
President Trump also raised eyebrows in Britain and Europe at large with a pointed assessment of the impact of immigration.
I think the immigration, allowing the immigration to take place in Europe is a shame. I think it changed the fabric of Europe.
This afternoon, the president doubled down, saying unchecked immigration has been bad for Europe.
I think they better watch themselves because you are changing culture, you are changing a lot of things, you're changing security. I mean, you take a look. I mean, look at what's happening to different countries that never had difficulty, never had problems. It's a very sad situation.
Monday's summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin was front and center today. President Trump outlining the issues they'll discuss: nuclear proliferation, Syria, Crimea, and meddling in the U.S. election.
I don't think you'll have any, gee, I did it, you got me. There won't be a Perry Mason here, I don't think, but you never know what happens, right? But I will absolutely, firmly ask the question. And hopefully we'll have a very good relationship with Russia.
After the indictment of 12 Russian intelligence agents for hacking DNC computers today, Democrats demanded President Trump scrap the summit. President Trump should cancel his meeting with Vladimir Putin, Chuck Schumer said in a statement. Glad-handing with Vladimir Putin on the heels of these indictments would be an insult to our democracy. But Prime Minister May gave her blessing to the meeting, saying it's better to talk than not.
I've welcomed the meeting with President Putin, but what is important is that the President goes into this, as he is doing, from a position of strength and also from a position of unity in NATO.
Before leaving England for a golf weekend in Scotland, President Trump and the First Lady stopped by Windsor Castle for a visit with Queen Elizabeth. They reviewed the palace guard together and then had tea. For the moment, at least, there doesn't appear to be any move to cancel Monday's summit with Putin. In a brief statement to the press tonight, the press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, simply saying, still on. Mike?
And John, President Trump also had a great deal of praise for Boris Johnson, Britain's former foreign secretary, who resigned this week.
Yeah, that was in that same interview in the Sun newspaper. Boris Johnson resigned because he didn't like Theresa May's Brexit plan. President Trump, in that interview with the Sun, said that he thought that Boris Johnson would make a great prime minister. The president was asked about that today, saying, well, wasn't that a diss of Theresa May, the current prime minister? The president said, no, absolutely not. I was simply asked what I thought of Boris Johnson and would he make a good prime minister? And I said, yes, someday he would make a good prime minister. And then he went on to praise Theresa May. So it looks like there were no hurt feelings, at least over that particular episode. Mike?
John Roberts on another action-packed day following the president. John, many thanks. While President Trump received the royal welcome from the government, thousands of people are showing their displeasure with the visit by taking to the streets. Correspondent Benjamin Hall has that part of the story tonight.
Thousands crammed the streets of London today to vent their anger at President Trump's visit to the UK. It was the largest protest in 15 years and brought parts of central London to a standstill.
It's important in the show of strength that there has been today, really. We're talking over 100,000 people that have turned out today as a campaign against Donald Trump's visit to the UK. He's not wanted here. The members of the public don't want us here. The majority of Parliament don't want us here. And it's an insult for Theresa May to invite him.
But the protest was not just about the president's visit. There were also various chants to fight for climate change, fight for Palestinian rights, fight for socialism, and fight for Muslim rights. This is now the biggest protest the UK has seen since 2003, but it's more of an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-Brexit protest as it is about anti-President Trump. And sadly, many of the protests against the president are personal, not political. Among them, a 24-tall blimp that depicted the president as a baby holding a cell phone, which was the centerpiece for demonstrators. London Mayor Sadiq Khan gave his express permission for it to fly in Parliament Square, citing freedom of speech. But there was outcry among members of the public and government who said that the mayor condoning this was the worst way to welcome the UK's closest ally. Something President Trump reiterated in an interview with the Sun newspaper by saying Khan has not been hospitable to a government that is very important. President Trump never saw the protests in person, as this was a working visit. Instead, he held bilateral working meetings with the government and met with the Prime Minister and the Queen at Chequers, Windsor and Blenheim Palace, where the red carpet was certainly rolled out for him.
That was Benjamin Hall reporting. As we told you earlier, Russian election interference was already going to be part of the Trump-Putin summit. It is safe to say today it moved up significantly on the agenda, but there are other matters to be discussed. Correspondent Jillian Turner looks at the list.
I'm not going in with high expectations, but we may come out with some very surprising things.
President Trump striking a take-it-or-leave-it tone today when asked about his upcoming Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin. The two aren't exactly strangers. They've met at least 3 times and had 8 phone calls in the last 18 months. And the laundry list of items on the president's mind hasn't changed much.
We'll be talking to President Putin about a number of things. Ukraine, Syria. We'll be talking about other parts of the Middle East. I will be talking about nuclear proliferation.
And the elephant in the room?
And we'll be talking about other things, meddling, and I will absolutely bring that up.
While most of these agenda items are highly contentious, policy experts point out one issue the two could potentially agree on, the nuclear treaty known as New START.
Nuclear arms control is the one place where the U.S. and Russia are the two great powers. And so the Russians should want this, the U.S. should want this.
New START limits the number of nuclear weapons each side's allowed to maintain in their arsenals, and also allows Washington and Moscow to monitor one another. Under the terms, neither side can have more than 700 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 1,550 nuclear warheads, and 800 missile launchers. As of now, the treaty is set to expire in 2021, but can be extended for 5 years, something Putin's in favor of and administration sources say President Trump is considering. During a time when lawmakers on both sides of the aisle accuse the president of being soft on Russia, experts say getting a revamped nuclear treaty out of Monday's summit could be a home run.
Doing an arms control deal with the Russians is not a game changer, but it's a good, solid act to stabilize the relationship.
And something's always better than nothing.
Don't knock steps forward.
Policy experts insist when it comes to the nuclear issue these days, both North Korea and Iran pose a greater threat than Russia. But that doesn't make the stakes for Monday's meeting any lower. Former Bush and Obama administration officials say if the president leaves Helsinki with a New START deal, everyone will get behind it. Mike?
Jillian Turner live in Washington on the next big summit. Jillian, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
We will have a special edition of Special Reports Sunday night live from Helsinki. Please join Bret Baier, 6 p.m. Eastern, right here on Fox. The Pentagon has identified the U.S. Army Ranger who died during a combat operation in Afghanistan Thursday. 32-year-old Army Sergeant First Class Christopher Solis of Summerville, South Carolina, was killed by enemy small arms fire near the Pakistan border. He was on his 5th deployment. Solis is the 2nd American soldier to die in the past week. 4 U.S. service members have been killed in action in Afghanistan this year. A group of 18 women who served as law clerks for Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh is encouraging his confirmation. The women wrote a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee calling Kavanaugh one of the strongest advocates in the federal judiciary for women lawyers. Whether that endorsement will have any effect on the confirmation process is an open question tonight as more Democrats line up against Kavanaugh. Correspondent Doug McKelway tells us where things stand right now.
The latest attack on Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh came today from the Democrat whose opportunity to reshape the high court was lost with her defeat in 2016.
You know, I used to worry that they wanted to turn the clock back to the 1950s. Now I worry they want to turn it back to the 1850s.
It is part and parcel of the broadside against Kavanaugh that began the moment his nomination was announced.
He's even argued that sitting presidents shouldn't face criminal investigation.
That, a reference to Kavanaugh's view that such an investigation would, quote, cripple the federal government.
I was a prosecutor for 8 years. I didn't think anybody was above the law.
Left out of that argument, Kavanaugh's belief that only the Constitution provides the punishment for a misbehaving president by impeachment. Republicans were prepared for these attacks.
This was, in some cases, quite literally a fill-in-the-blank opposition. They wrote statements of opposition only to fill in the name later.
But the Democrats' death by 1,000 cuts approach is unusually vitriolic. Senator Debbie Stabenow announced today before his first hearing she's already a no vote, stabbing away without evidence at what she says will be Kavanaugh's rollback of rights for reproductive health, insurance coverage, and environmental protections, among others. And word of a new attack. A far-left group called Ultraviolet is demanding Democrats investigate what Kavanaugh knew 27 years ago, when he clerked for former federal judge Alex Kozinski. Kozinski retired in December after groping allegations dating from the 1990s. In a Wall Street Journal op-ed yesterday, a colleague of Kavanaugh notes this observation about one of his former clerks, quote, "He's been an incredible mentor to me despite the fact that I'm a left-of-center woman." The op-ed also notes that more than a quarter of his clerks have been minorities, and more than half of them, 25 out of 48, have been women. Mike?
Doug McElway on the Kavanaugh confirmation process. Thank you. Up next, how the military plans to use a new facility to modernize its approach to warfare. Program for the military in the great state of Texas. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin tells us what is supposed to be different about this new approach.
It's the biggest reorganization of the U.S. Army in half a century. The Pentagon announced Austin, Texas as the site of its new Futures Command to be run by a four-star general. Some compare it to a modern-day Manhattan Project, a reference to the government-funded research that produced the first nuclear weapons.
We're in the midst of a change in the very character of war. And we don't and didn't have an organization solely dedicated to that. That's important.
Whoever gets there first will have unmatched lethality on the battlefield for years to come. Whether it's hypersonics for long-range precision fires or whether it's robotics and artificial intelligence for our next-generation combat vehicle.
The goal to establish dominance in cutting-edge warfighting technologies, especially in cyberspace, before the Chinese and Russians do.
If we just sit back and don't react, we will lose our technological superiority in 2020. The Chinese are right. With the Chinese, you have to protect what you have, because if they can't learn about it, they'll try to buy it. And if they can't learn about it or buy it, they'll try to steal it.
Skeptics say the Army wasted billions of dollars on future combat systems in the past that became white elephant procurement projects. They are less worried about potential security breaches due to partnering with civilian tech companies.
One insider can download millions of files onto a USB stick and then distribute that. And we've seen that on multiple occasions. But I don't know that going to Austin increases that at all.
Under the old bureaucracy, it would take the Army 10 to 15 years to field a new technology for the troops. The hope now is by setting up a new tech-focused command near an innovation hub like Austin, the Army can shorten that to months rather than years.
The first soldiers tasked with setting up the command landed in Austin today. The question is whether tech companies and their engineers will work with the Defense Department. We've already seen employees at Google and elsewhere push back on helping the Pentagon. Mike?
Jennifer Griffin on the Army's new Future Command. Jennifer, thanks. The Inspector General at the Health and Human Services Department says the government wasted at least $341,000 on travel by ousted Secretary Tom Price. The report says that included booking charter flights without considering cheaper scheduled airlines. It says the government spent nearly $1.2 million on Price's travel during his 7 months in office. Of the 21 official trips, only one fully complied with federal requirements. Stocks were up. The Dow gained 94.5. The S&P 500 finished ahead 3. NASDAQ inched up 2. For the week, the Dow jumped 2 3/10 percentage points. The S&P 500 rose 1.5%. NASDAQ grew more than 1 3/4. Up next, whatever happened to Joe the Plumber? First, beyond our borders tonight, the Pakistani government says at least 128 people were killed when a bomb exploded near a rally for a politician running for a seat in the provincial legislature. The candidate was among the dead. 300 other people were injured. Earlier, 4 people were killed in another bombing near a rally for a different candidate. The Commerce Department has lifted a ban on U.S. companies selling goods to Chinese telecommunications giant ZTE. The move comes following the company's payment of a $1 billion penalty and the placement of $400 million in escrow as part of a settlement reached last month. Counterterrorism detectives in Great Britain investigating the contamination of 2 people by a Russian-made nerve agent believe they have found the source of the deadly substance. Scientists say it was in a bottle recovered during the search of the home of one of 2 people poisoned last week. One of those victims died. The other is in serious condition. Just some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back. Voters there have seen before. Correspondent Jonathan Seri tells us from Montgomery tonight.
You got a good crowd here?
In her bid for a 5th term in Congress, Alabama Republican Martha Roby faces a tough battle within her own party. A GOP primary runoff against Bobby Bright, the former Democratic representative she defeated back in 2010, now running as a Republican.
Our people want to change, and they want it now. Her supporters are soft because they feel like she's been compromised.
Tell you that I would love to have your vote.
Roby's troubles stem from her decision to withdraw support from Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign after he was heard talking about groping women in an old Access Hollywood tape.
Mr. Trump, I would like for you to step aside.
That's right. Martha Roby told Donald Trump to step aside and refused to vote for him for president.
The campaign is long over. We have been governing, and President Donald Trump is just that. He's president of the United States. Of course I want him to be successful.
President Trump has endorsed the incumbent, describing her in a tweet as a consistent and reliable vote for our Make America Great Again agenda.
If he believes that she's supporting his agenda, then that goes a long way with me.
As the incumbent, Roby enjoys strong support and funding from Washington, but Alabama voters are fiercely independent.
I can support the president, and I can support Bobby Bright.
And failing to win last month's Republican primary outright is a liability for Roby.
If you're an incumbent and you outspend your opposition 3-1, and you only get 38% of the vote, you're in trouble.
Both candidates bill themselves as conservative, anti-abortion, pro-gun, supportive of the military and farming. So for Republican voters in this red district, the choice may come down to what they see as the greater sin, being a former Democrat or a former critic of President Trump. In Montgomery, Alabama, Jonathan Seri, Fox News.
In tonight's Whatever Happened to, Joe the Plumber, the Ohio man shot to fame in the 2008 presidential election after he questioned Barack Obama during a campaign stop over the candidate's small business tax policy. So where's he now a decade later? Correspondent Matt Finn has the answer.
Today, Joe the Plumber is more Joe the family and businessman.
Sissy gets in the middle. Ladies first.
44-year-old Samuel Joe Wurzelbacher is now remarried with 4 children.
We kept on tossing football.
In the front yard of his Ohio home, Joe points out where his sudden launch to fame all began.
And that's when Barack Obama was standing right here.
On a Sunday morning in 2008, Joe was tossing a football with his oldest son when then presidential candidate Barack Obama dropped by his neighborhood to campaign.
Secret Service obviously patted me down. I walked up to him and I told him, hey, listen, I'm thinking about buying a company.
Your new tax plan is going to tax me more, doesn't it? Joe figured it was the perfect time to ask Obama about his proposed plan to increase taxes.
My thinking was when Barack Obama was speaking then, if you work hard, we're going to penalize you. So that's why I essentially asked that question. I was not persuaded in any way, shape, or form.
All right, guys, I got to get out of here.
Cameras captured the encounter, and overnight, Joe the Plumber became the face of everyday Americans with similar concerns about taxes and jobs.
The conversation I had with Joe the Plumber.
Joe the Plumber.
Joe the Plumber.
Joe the Plumber.
Joe's story was picked up by John McCain's campaign and used as a political prop against Obama.
Of course they wanted to use me. The only reason why I even came out as for John McCain is the simple fact that I didn't want Barack Obama in office.
After McCain's loss, Joe wrote a book,
me, or I think about something,
had a stint as a war correspondent, and ran for Congress but lost. Today, Joe still works with his hands, but he says he has a new calling.
You have the handle
to protect students.
And then if you try to open the door...
He's an executive for a company that makes a simple steel barricade designed to prevent shooters from opening classroom doors.
19 years since Columbine, and most schools still don't have security in place to protect the kids. So I've decided to leave politics behind.
Joe says he never asked to be a known person.
Oh, I gotta go, boy.
And actually finds his sudden fame ironic.
I didn't seek out Barack Obama. He came to my neighborhood. You know, I think Joe the plumber, in a good way, shows that God's got a sense of humor.
There were some bumps in the road, including accusations of racism and an unsuccessful lawsuit he filed against the state of Ohio alleging privacy violations in an attempt to smear him. But Joe doesn't have regrets.
Since then, I got a beautiful wife. I got 3 brand new kids out of it. I mean, I couldn't be happier.
Joe tells us he turned down some opportunities to perhaps cash in on his sudden fame because he says they would have compromised his beliefs. He wanted to maintain respect from his family and friends. Mike.
Matt Finn on Joe the Plumber a decade later. Matt, thanks a lot. The Justice Department accuses a dozen Russians of interfering in the 2016 election just days before the Trump-Putin summit. We'll get reaction from the panel.
For conspiring to interfere with the 2016 presidential election. The defendants accessed email accounts of volunteers and employees of a U.S. presidential campaign, including the campaign chairman. They also hacked into the computer networks of a congressional campaign committee and a national political committee.
I'll be meeting with President Putin on Monday. We'll be talking about meddling, and I will absolutely bring that up.
It's not like a Trump-Putin summit lacked for drama, and then all of a sudden you have Rod Rosenstein the Friday before dropping a bombshell, indictments on 12 Russian nationals. With that, let's bring in our panel. Matthew Continetti, editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon, Karen Tumulty, opinion writer for the Washington Post, and Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. Panel, welcome. Molly, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's always good when you can hold people accountable for attacking a political party when a foreign entity has attacked a political party. I'm not entirely sure how much new there is here. It read very much like an unredacted version of that report that came out of the Nunes Committee, the House Intelligence Committee. We already knew sort of the means by which they had done these phishing attempts and about the electoral systems that were looked into, and it also confirmed what we saw in that report, which is that this happened before Donald Trump was the nominee. It actually happened before Super Tuesday, before the Florida, Ohio, Illinois primaries. These Russians planned to release their information before he was the presumptive nominee. So it's very good to find these Russians and hold them accountable. If you are a believer in the collusion theory, you didn't get a lot to go with.
I think it was a major turn in the investigation because with these indictments, the Mueller investigation goes actually right to the heart of Vladimir Putin's government. We're not talking about Russian troll farms here. We're not talking about sort of mischief makers. And the fact that these indictments would be handed up 3 days before the president's conversation with President Putin is highly significant. And one question here is the president knew that these indictments were coming before this trip, so his comments about witch hunts and the like have been sort of interesting in light of the fact that he knew something that we didn't on this trip.
Speaking of witch hunts, there's been conversation about whether or not the Mueller probe is a witch hunt. Take a listen to this.
My hope and prayer is that this president and his allies will again cease and desist on calling the Mueller investigation a witch hunt.
I call it the rigged witch hunt. I think that really hurts our country, and it really hurts our relationship with Russia.
So there you go. Matthew?
I think when Trump calls it a witch hunt, he's referring to the narrative of collusion between these Russian agents and members of his campaign. And so it's important to know that, so we've charged the Russians who are up to no good in terms of interfering with the election on social media. Today we charge the Russians who were up to no good actually hacking and phishing the DNC, the DCCC, and John Podesta. And while there are Americans who are mentioned in this 29-page indictment, so far we've had no Americans charged in connection with that crime. So I think that's what the president is saying when he's calling it a witch hunt.
There's also talk today about expectations going into the Trump-Putin summit. Take a listen to this.
We'll be talking to President Putin about a number of things. Ukraine. We'll be talking about Syria. We'll be talking about other parts of the Middle East. I will be talking about nuclear proliferation.
The issues of strategic stability and disarmament and armaments control as number one. And number two, definitely combating terrorism and extremism.
So, Molly, your thoughts heading into the big summit?
Yeah, I think it is appropriate to have expectations be very low. Relations between these two countries have been bad for a long time. So just even a slight softening could be helpful for achieving things. It is good also that they're starting to talk about a New START treaty. Vladimir Putin had actually proposed that early on in the Trump administration, and President Trump had kind of batted him away. He has this belief that all of the agreements that President Obama arranged are bad deals, but sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not true. And one of the things that our two countries have done a good job with are nuclear agreements, and it's important to keep those and maintain those. So it's good if they start talking about that. But again, things have been so chilly. Keep expectations very low.
Karen, we had a bunch of Democrats on the Hill call for canceling the Trump-Putin summit after the indictments today. Your thoughts?
That is not surprising, but I don't know that that is anything more than kind of election year posturing. One thing, though, that I think everyone should keep their eye on is the fact that if Russia did this before, they are likely to be trying to do it again. And I would like to see what kind of guarantees the president can come out of this meeting with that this is not going to happen this year in these midterm elections, because I've got to tell you, Congress has been pretty much asleep at the switch in hardening our own election defenses.
Right. A lot of bickering, but not a lot of action in terms of the folks behind us on Capitol Hill. There's been some question about whether President Trump would be tough with the Russians. Check this out.
We have been extremely tough on Russia, including the fact that when the prime minister called, when they had a horrible thing happen right here, very close by, we expelled how many people? 60. $34 billion more was raised since I became president in NATO. That means that the other 28 countries have put in $34 billion more into NATO. Do you think Putin's happy about that?
Certainly Presidents Trump and Putin are charming, but do you expect some tough talk in that summit, Matthew?
I would hope so. And I think the president and his team recognized that a year ago, when President Trump met with President Putin, they arranged a ceasefire in southwestern Syria, a ceasefire that was broken by the Syrian government, aided by the Russian government last month. So I think that goes a long way to telling us how much trust we should put in Russian promises, which is not much.
Final thoughts on going into this summit on Monday?
Well, it really is true that Russians are bad people, but that is not sufficient for a foreign policy. We really need to think through what we want to have, how we want to work with them, particularly if we're expecting
bad government. Let's not blast all Russian people.
But they're bad guys, but that's not sufficient. You need to actually have a goal, and you need to give them a reason to work with us, particularly if we want to accomplish things in Syria, in Ukraine, in the war on terror, in nuclear disarmament. We need to give them a reason to work with us, and again, just try and rebuild a little bit of trust, of which there's almost none right now.
Keep your objectives low. Trade, maybe an extension New START with Russian compliance on the INF treaty, which they have been in violation of now for over a year, and maybe you have a deal.
Karen?
Well, it'll also be, I think the outcome of this meeting is going to be very important, especially after all the drama of this week, and kind of reassuring our allies, too, that there is a strategy. Because right now, I think the president comes out of this European trip having left a lot of our closest allies very, very concerned about this meeting.
All right, let's leave that there. Next up, the Friday lightning round. President Trump and the British Prime Minister, the cabinet.
We solve a lot of problems with the good old recording instrument. And she's a total professional, because when I saw her this morning, I said, I want to apologize because I said such good things about you.
So there were some sensational headlines in The Sun, and the president smoothed it over today with Prime Minister Theresa May. It was pretty clear that the president's mind was also pretty focused on trade between the U.S. and the U.K.
The only thing I ask of Theresa is that we make sure we can trade, that we don't have any restrictions, because we want to trade with the UK. And the UK wants to trade with us.
There will be no limit to the possibility of us doing trade deals around the rest of the world once we leave the European Union.
And with that, we're back with our panel, Matthew, Karen, and Molly. Molly, your thoughts at this meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister May?
Well, you were absolutely right that he is laser focused on trade and really laser focused on getting good deals for the United States. He's been saying this for many years, and this is a continuation. It is interesting or even funny sometimes to see people's reaction to his blunt talking, even in diplomatic scenarios. And usually people who are world leaders are very good at sort of not saying what they mean or wandering around it, and he just says it straight out, like he thinks May did a bad job with Brexit, which is true, and other problems that they're facing, and he just says it sort of in a very straightforward fashion. We're not used to that.
Although then he tried to say he didn't say it and that it was just fake news, and unfortunately for him there was an actual audio of him criticizing Theresa May and specifically saying that she hadn't taken his advice on Brexit and it was going to affect trade, unfortunately, in a negative way. So that is why we heard something that we rarely hear from Donald Trump, which was an apology.
But it seemed like the charm offensive today, that they seemed to get along pretty well, at least in front of the cameras. And
I think the fact that she was so gracious about, the president walking back his own negative comments about her probably is something that, is going to play to her advantage as well at home.
Matthew, your thoughts on U.S.-UK relations after this meeting today?
Well, I think the entire week has kind of been a display of what America First foreign policy looks like. And what that means is that our traditional alliances, the president views them as more of constraints than actual extensions of American power. And so that puts a lot of foreign leaders who are traditionally, and especially when Democrats are in office, have very good relations with the United States, it puts them on their toes. Where it heads, I don't think anyone really knows.
Believe it or not, also this week was the nomination of Judge Bret Kavanaugh to the High Court. It feels like, with so much news in between, it feels like maybe it was a few weeks ago, but it was this week. The president talked a bit about, actually, check that. We had some criticism coming from a former nominee for president, Hillary Clinton.
It is a blatant attempt by this administration to shift the balance of the court for decades and to reverse decades of progress. I used to worry that they wanted to turn the clock back to the 1950s. Now I worry they want to turn it back to the 1850s.
Matthew, your thoughts on the criticism we heard from Democrats this week of the Kavanaugh nomination?
I think the Democrats have come up very short, and the oppo that we've seen so far in the mainstream press has almost been contradictory. I think the Washington Post criticized Kavanaugh for credit card debt and also having an elite background on the same day, which kind of shows how weak the arguments against him are and the opposition research is. I think when you combine that with some of the red state Democrats distancing themselves from Chuck Schumer and the Democratic leadership, you see that at the moment Kavanaugh's nomination is in a very good place.
The reality is 10 Democrats in states President Trump won are up for re-election in November, and so they have to look, do my constituents want me to support Brett Kavanaugh, or do my constituents want me to follow Democratic leadership, right, Karen?
And I think we should, in many ways, what's happening in the Senate chamber is theater. We all know how this is going to come out. Kavanaugh is going to get his seat on the Supreme Court. I think right now the more interesting politics is to be looking at, and I wrote a column on this week, to be looking at is how this is playing in the states, because in things like, if Roe versus Wade gets rolled back, it's really becoming a big issue now in some things like governor's races of how you would respond to this.
Your thoughts on the Kavanaugh nomination at this stage?
Right. When Gorsuch was announced, he was someone who really electrified the base and also angered people on the left. In this case, you have a nominee who very much excites the D.C. establishment. The base is also pleased, but they're not having that same level of excitement. Without that, it's very difficult to have the kind of culture war fight that I think you're hearing people on the left try to gin up by talking about abortion or other issues. So it just seems like it'll be a little bit easier for him than if there were a big fight.
All right, it's Friday. Winners and losers. You want to start us off, Molly?
Sure. So Peter Strzok testified on the Hill yesterday. All we knew about him before yesterday were these texts he sent calling for Trump's impeachment or insurance policy to keep him from getting elected. And what was really interesting is he somehow came off in his hearing even worse than those texts would indicate. But having said that, thanks to a lot of obstruction from the Department of Justice, there's very little chance that he'll be held accountable, so he's the winner of the week. And my loser is that big, giant Trump baby balloon that flew over London. We were promised this like blimp-like balloon that was supposed to take care of everything. Instead, he was just kind of a tiny, cute balloon.
Karen, winners, losers?
I actually was really impressed by Rod Rosenstein's statement today, and I really would recommend people go back and read it, really explaining that this investigation is all about irrelevant of which party was getting attacked. It's all about maintaining the integrity of our democracy and our electoral system. Okay. And if I had to pick a low moment of the hearing yesterday, and it was plenty to pick from, I think Louis Gohmert would be the loser of the week.
Matthew, quickly.
Kylie Jenner, who's about to become the youngest billionaire in American history, is my winner. And my loser is Steve Cohen, the Democrat of Tennessee, who said that Strzok deserved a purple.
Stiff upper lip. No problem. She's going to walk away with possibly getting a trade deal when earlier in the week her government was falling apart.
I don't know. I think Boris Johnson left. I don't know that how close they are to actually falling apart. He says she's a strong leader. He wishes there were more leaders. I don't know. But I will say he goes over there. He stirs the pot. Then he tries to unstir the pot. Again, he is, the be-all of the whole story. But to me, you can't get over the fact that 100,000 people in the streets of London. I mean, forget the crying baby.
Really, they were arguing. Let me get Greg in here. The London protests, as I saw Benjamin Hall earlier reporting in that 2 o'clock hour, was that they were really campaigning against capitalism.
No, it's true. A lot of this, this is what happens with left-wing protests, is it becomes a grab bag of everything. You saw women dressed up as characters from The Handmaid's Tale, which is the fictional miniseries about a misogynistic dystopia where women are forced into sexual slavery. Now, I doubt any of those women dressed up as those handmaids ever did anything about the mass rape in England, what it has to do with is it Rotterdam? The sexual slavery that took place there was an absolute scandal that went on for years, and I don't see any signs for that. Now, but to Juan's point, everybody hates his style. Everybody hates his style. That's why he's punk rock. But the New York Times even had to admit today, was it today's paper? The headline was, Trump got everything Obama ever asked for.
I didn't see that headline, but it sounds like a good one.
That's not fake news.
That's one of the things in the New York Times I agree with.
But I think you guys understand, in a way, he's not even playing to the Europeans. He's not playing to Theresa May.
Everybody plays to their domestic audience.
Right, so he's playing to an American base. And when he brings up the immigration issue, he's trying to stir that up here. I think he talks about terrorism.
There's truth to it as well, though.
There's no truth. I mean, are you kidding? Europe, I mean, what did Theresa May say as she was standing there next to him? Immigration has been great for Great Britain. That's what she said.
But Juan, all of from Germany to Denmark, to Sweden, to all of these populists are rising up because of
correct. So I think he's playing. Hang on. He's playing to populist nationalist sentiments that he would like to excite here at home for the midterms. But that is not. It's not the case that you are breaking apart Europe and the fabric is being torn, and that the mayor of London is responsible for all this terrorism. I hope he says that to Vladimir Putin about poisoning people in London.
Jesse, one of the signs that they had today that I thought was kind of preposterous. It said, "No to Trump, no to war." Like, well, what war? Like, Trump is really not the warmongering
Just
president.
the war on the press.
Yeah,
That's the only war
understand
he's
that.
successfully prosecuting.
Like, what was
I spoke to someone.
Except for that one article today.
Except for the New York Times. I spoke to someone today who said these are not, the downtrodden, lower class people that have been crushed by the Industrial Revolution.
They're working.
These are people named Alistair that come from snobby backgrounds and went to nice prep schools that can afford to take the Friday afternoon off.
All right. The dust is still settling on Capitol Hill after an explosive public hearing with anti-Trump FBI agent Peter Strzok. This, as his lover, Lisa Page, is questioned behind closed doors today. All the developments next.
I would call it the witch hunt I would call it the rigged witch hunt after watching some of the little clips. I didn't get to watch too much because I'm here. It's a different time zone, to put it mildly. But after watching the people, the man that was testifying yesterday, I call it the rigged witch hunt.
That was the president earlier reacting to yesterday's House hearing with anti-Trump FBI agent Peter Strzok, a key player in the Hillary Clinton email and Russia investigations. The president's comments came just moments before Robert Mueller indicted 12 Russian officers for election meddling. As you know, yesterday's hearing was contentious, ugly, and fiery, and Republicans and Democrats still going at it.
We won't get justice from the Democrats. If you watched the hearing today, you saw the Democrats give a 5-hour cat bath to Peter Strzok.
The Republicans did not show up yesterday to hear the answers. They wanted to use the questions to undermine Bob Mueller's investigation. This is all an effort to protect the president.
You actually had a Democrat say that because Strzok was testifying and we were asking him hard questions, that he deserved a Purple Heart. Yeah, I mean, how absurd can you be to suggest something like that?
I think the Republicans acted like the defense team of Donald Trump, and I'm sure the Kremlin is very, very happy.
I think it just shows how much they hate Donald Trump. This is a guy who's been demoted by the FBI, who's been criticized by the FBI director, by the inspector general, demoted to the human resources, and is under investigation for an ethics review.
This was clearly a show put on by the Republicans. I think we're really being distracted by this hearing, and I think that was probably the main purpose, to try to raise questions again about the Mueller investigation.
Meanwhile, former FBI attorney Lisa Page meeting with congressional investigators behind closed doors after initially defying a subpoena to answer questions about her text message exchanges trashing Trump. All right, Greg, the dust is settled after yesterday's hearing. Now, how do you feel about it?
Everyone, I know people are going to get mad. Everyone there was obnoxious. Everybody on both sides. What bothered me were the self-appointed white knights of the Democrats rushing to defend Strzok as if he was a princess stuck in high dungeon. Then there were the Republicans showboating to a point where they actually turned him into Oliver North. But first you had the Democrats offering Strzok more cover than an oversized straw hat. And then you had the Republicans constantly trying to pull off the oversized straw hat. It drove me crazy. But the thing is, the point of this whole hearing is there's nothing you're going to get out of talking to Strzok, because accusing somebody of bias in 2016 is like accusing someone of being high at Woodstock. We were all biased. I know I was. I mean, we had some serious fights here. Everybody had strong feelings. And I know you're going to say, but he was an FBI agent, he was in charge of investigation. But you can't prove that his bias affected that. You can believe it. I believe it. Right. But I can't prove it.
Very difficult to prove.
And the inspector general said that very thing. He said, it's obvious, looks like bias, but I can't say that there was any action that he took that was because of it. I don't know.
Do you think there's anything substantive to come out of this hearing that people can sink their teeth into? Or
Well,
is this
I think,
just
if there, if there were, that we would be talking about it. Okay, so I think that what happened is this drove partisans on both sides to their deepest, darkest corners. No new info, no minds changed, and Strzok was quite smug and arrogant, and why they didn't just let him be that way instead of making themselves look horrible, and that's what everybody's talking about.
He definitely came across. Why don't you tell us, Dana? Gee, how did Louis Gohmert make Republicans look horrible yesterday?
I already said it yesterday, and there's plenty of press about that today.
I mean, I just think it was way rude to somehow try to shame him for his affair and then bring his wife in. I mean, just awful.
I already said that yesterday.
But I'm just telling you today, because I think that you're asking about today and the impact it's had. So the key point yesterday was, from a Republican perspective, let's prove that this man was so biased that the entire investigation into Trump is, in fact, useless, that you can't honestly judge what happened if the Russian interference and potential collusion because of Peter Strzok's behavior. In fact, what it revealed, if you want a news headline from yesterday, was there was no such plot to undermine Trump. That he could have come out with news about the Russian investigation.
No.
He didn't do it.
No.
Go ahead.
No, people keep saying this, and I think that's absolutely incorrect. Hillary Clinton was under a criminal investigation because there was enough evidence of potential wrongdoing to have a criminal investigation by the FBI. The Russia investigation was a counterintelligence investigation, largely looking at a foreign power potentially involved in our elections. Two entirely different things. Again, Comey told President Trump when he was first elected 3 different times that he wasn't under investigation. So no, those aren't two those aren't two of the same thing. So I hate when people say that because it's not true.
So let me respond to you. What you have now is a situation where Mike Flynn and others in the Trump campaign, in fact, have either pled guilty or today, as we saw in terms of the indictment, you see people who were reaching out. Now, Rod Rosenstein today said nobody on the American side may have been aware of the efforts by these Russians. But what you have, Lisa, is today with the indictment, I think it was 12 today, you had 13 indicted in February. It's clear there was Russian interference ongoing, and the effort by people like
Hillary Clinton, the subject of a criminal investigation is different than a counterintelligence.
No, it's not,
yes,
because it was an ongoing investigation being run by the FBI, and guess who was in charge? Peter Strzok. Okay. But the big point for me is here you get President Trump today saying, I guess I'll bring it up with Putin on Monday, but there was no Perry Mason. There's not going to be any Perry Mason moment.
All right, let's get someone else in here. To your point, Juan, I mean, at that point in the Hillary deal, she had already set up a private server against the law and then shredded all the emails. So there was obvious evidence of wrongdoing. They started this counterintelligence investigation.
Notable quotables.
We have a long, beautiful week. If those requests were gangster like they are, the world is a gangster.
I want to cross, as I've said before, between Socrates and Dirty Harry.
The girls on the team call me Coach K.
This just must not become the next justice on the Supreme Court.
This is a nominee who wants to pave the path to tyranny.
This far-left rhetoric comes out every single time. But the apocalypse never comes.
After going through the roller coaster of emotions, everybody will feel relieved, jubilant.
Mr. Strozak. Mr. Strauss.
Mr. Strozak. Special Agent Strzok.
This is a stupid and ridiculous hearing.
This is unbelievable, but that's where it's gotten to now, and it's as frustrating as it can get.
Like many people, I had and expressed personal political opinions during an extraordinary presidential election.
You said, OMG, this is effing terrifying. I think we know what effing means. I'm pretty sure we have OMG down, too.
So I have NATO.
The United States is paying far too much, and other countries are not paying enough.
Yeah, America, appreciate your allies. After all, you don't have that many.
I have the UK, which is in somewhat turmoil.
How can anyone have faith in the Prime Minister getting a good deal when she can't even broker a deal within her own cabinet?
And I have Putin. Frankly, Putin may be the easiest of them all. Who would think? Who would think?
The ultimate winner this week, the Thai soccer team rescued from the cave. That's it for Special Report tonight. I'm Mike Emanuel in Washington. A quick reminder, Sunday's a special edition of Special Report Live. Bret Baier will be anchoring from Helsinki as we get ready for President Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Story, hosted by Martha